I am Akshobh Giridharadas here with the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, and we're delighted to be doing this in association with partnership with the Asia Society Policy Institute, or ASPI, and the look ahead of what lies ahead for India and its foreign policy. Obviously, all of us have been following the news from April 19 to June 4. The world's largest democracy went to the polls, and just some staggering numbers, right? 44-day election, 900 million eligible voters, 640 million ballots cast, half of them women voters, a 67% turnout, over a million polling booths, and 5 million electronic voting machines. But that was then. All the analysis has been done on the elections, and we seem to be back to the era of coalition governments. But from what the recent cabinet appointments show us, coalition could also mean continuity. So this foreign policy webinar is going to be a look ahead to what lies ahead for India's foreign policy. How does India see the world, and how does the world see India? How does India interact with other countries, both near and far? And I'd be remiss if I did not introduce my guests before they introduce the topics themselves. I am delighted to be joined by Farwa Aamer. She's my partner in crime in putting this webinar together. So Farwa is currently the Director of South Asia Initiatives at ASPI, and along with Lisa Curtis, Senior Fellow and Director at the Indo-Pacific Security Program at CNAS. And we should be hopefully joined by Vikram Singh, Senior Advisor, Defense and Aerospace at USISPF. Apologies for the delay because we're still trying to get Vikram on the call. But in the meanwhile, want to get things right underway. Farwa, your portfolio is South Asia. There's never a dull day here. And we saw recently right now with the swearing in of Prime Minister Modi and SAARC leaders coming to the summit, it goes back to the swearing in. Goes back to 2014 when a host of world leaders were invited. The difference between then and now is, of course, there's no Nawaz Sharif, no Hamid Karzai, no Pakistan, no Afghanistan represented. And perhaps it also is telling of how things have changed in Afghanistan and Pakistan with the leadership and the economic fortunes. But what does this mean for India's neighborhood first policy, which was very, very central to Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy when he first took office?
Sure. Thank you, Akshobh. And very quickly, on behalf of the Asia Society Policy Institute, it's great to be collaborating with the USISPF and sharing space with Lisa and hopefully soon with Vikram on this very important topic in light of Prime Minister Modi's third term. On South Asia, as you correctly pointed out, we've seen Prime Minister Modi prioritize the neighborhood first policy in general, throughout both of his terms, with certain limitations, of course. This neighborhood first policy essentially sort of prioritizes improving physical, digital, and people-to-people connectivity between India and its neighbors, while also boosting trade and commerce. Now, in the previous two terms, just starting in with how Prime Minister Modi's swearing-in ceremonies went around. If we look back, as we talked about 2014 just right now, where all SAARC countries were invited and present, including Afghanistan and Pakistan, like you mentioned. And we also saw Prime Minister Modi choosing Bhutan as the first country to visit right after being elected. Again, something in the neighborhood. So you could see that implementation of that neighborhood first policy by way of his actions already. In 2019, when he was elected for another term, relations with with Pakistan, of course, by then had deteriorated, and BIMSTEC had gained more prominence over SAARC. So it was unsurprising that we saw a heavier BIMSTEC presence during Prime Minister Modi's second term. Even now in these elections, when the final results started coming out, confirming Prime Minister Modi's third term, some of the first congratulatory messages came from the neighborhood, from Bhutan, from Nepal, from Bangladesh, and from Sri Lanka. And Prime Minister Modi also thanked them with fervor. And these heads of states, as well as President Muzu of Maldives, were all invited to the swearing-in ceremony that took place on Sunday, which also showed that not only is India keeping that whole momentum around the neighborhood first policy intact, but also some degree of reciprocation being continued through the neighbors as well. Unsurprisingly, like you mentioned, we don't have Afghanistan and Pakistan present this time round for at least the oath-taking ceremony, but still through Twitter diplomacy or what have you, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif tweeted a brief congratulatory message, and then his brother, the Pakistan Muslim League Noon head, former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, known for being one to kind of back rapprochement efforts towards India, had a longer message, one that was conveying this intent of replacing hate with hope for the prosperity in the region. But what is important to note, just because we're not sort of looking forward, is to also look at the factors that have been driving this neighborhood first policy to the forefront throughout Prime Minister Modi's terms. And one important one is, of course, China's presence in the region, whether it's through the BRI or just geostrategically as well. And the competition that has been unfolding between India and China within the region, it has sort of pushed India to kind of step up its regional role more than ever and developing partnership with neighbors, partially to reduce the dependency on China. We've seen India open up a trade and dialogues with its neighbors, open up energy trade opportunities, encouraging economic investments. In 2020, I think what was momentum was during the COVID-19 pandemic, India showcased this very remarkable sort of medical diplomacy to provide critical health supplies to neighbors. India has also emerged as a leading provider of developmental assistance and sort of security aid for most South Asian neighbors, except for like prominently perhaps Pakistan. And one example of it is, of course, the support of $4 billion in loans and grants that was provided to Sri Lanka when it was dealing with debt and food and fuel shortages in 2022. These are all positive overtures, and India is likely to maintain this momentum. Again, some of it being driven by China, but again, India's own interests and ambitions of being an important regional player, and not just for South Asia, but also now, being the voice of the global South. So this neighborhood first policy aligns with a number of its foreign policy objectives, and we likely see a lot of continuity there. Stop that.
No, thank you, Farwa. And I'm glad to see Vikram, you're back on the call. It's a wonderful life's little ironies. You're from Silicon Valley, and yet tech just precluded you from joining in. Before I go to
I didn't get that gene when I was born at Stanford.
welcome, Vikram. Nonetheless,
I'm glad I could finally be here. And hi, Farwa. Hi, Lisa.
No, perfect. We're glad to have you as well. Before I go to Lisa for my next question, I just want to remind folks to keep your questions coming in. We have the chat box here for Vikram, Lisa, Farwa. So please keep your questions coming in, and we'll get to them after the moderated Q&A. Lisa, Farwa touched on some of India's foreign policy objectives, and it's been a decade of Prime Minister Modi, and it's going to be 5 years more. Obviously, solidified his place and base as one of the most influential leaders in the world, partly where India's economy has also gone to a G5 economy. Even though we speak about coalitions, in this case, coalition means sort of continuity. So do you foresee a continuity in India foreign policy, particularly also US-India relations as well?
Well, thank you, Akshobh, for inviting me today. And it's really great to be here. And thanks also to USISPF and the Asia Policy Institute, ASPI. And I'm so glad that Vikram could join us. I would think that, I'm speaking to you today from India, and you would think I would be the one to have the technological problems being so far away. But anyway, it's great to be here. And, great question. I think, the simple answer is we will see more continuity than change when it comes to India's foreign policy. I think, that Modi may be distracted by coalition politics and managing the coalition and, domestic issues. So that may take some time away, some time. Maybe he won't be able to do every single foreign trip or focus on, major foreign policy initiatives. But I think by and large, we will see continuity in the foreign policy. And I think, one of the pieces of evidence of this is the fact that Jaishankar has been, renamed foreign minister. I think, that tells us that we should not expect major changes in the offing. US-India ties have been very strong under Modi. He made a very successful visit to Washington last year. The U.S. has agreed to co-produce jet engine technology, really a breakthrough agreement. We've seen the ISET dialogue, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, taking off, deepening. So, the relationship has really been very strong, and I fully expect that to continue. I think both countries realize it's in their mutual interest to continue building and solidifying this partnership. So I fully expect that to continue. I think India will remain fully engaged with the Quad. There have been a lot of questions. There was no leader level meeting. Is the Squad taking the Quad over? The Squad, of course, being the security quad of the US, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, whose defense ministers have met twice now. But I think, the Quad is here to stay. This is an organization that all four countries see as very important to their foreign policy, to creating a structure in the Indo-Pacific that can really, protect that free and open order. And of course, it's not a military grouping, and India, won't change its views on that. I don't think India will ever want this to be an explicitly military organization, but it still plays an extremely important role in, making sure that the region remains stable and peaceful, and that countries can, protect their own sovereignty and independence. And I think the coalition partners, the main partners, the Janata Dal United and the TDP, these leaders, Nitish Kumar, Chandrababu Naidu, they're not going to be, foreign policy won't be the first thing on their minds. They're going to be focused on domestic politics. So I don't see a lot of interference in what Prime Minister Modi wants to do with foreign policy. Now, if there's a crisis, some kind of crisis breaks out, then certainly, they will factor into the decision making. But that won't be their first instinct. They'll largely focus on domestic politics. So yeah, I think that we should not have any concerns about any major changes in India's foreign policy. And frankly, I think that would have been the case no matter what the result of the elections were.
Yep.
Both of our countries, in the US, it's bipartisan. And I think, leaders in India are bought into this partnership. They realize the logic of it, the importance of it, and that it benefits both of them. So I don't see that changing.
No, thank you, Lisa. That feeds into a lot of my next question. And Vikram, I know you had tech issues coming in, so it's only fair I, give you a home run for this. 2023, an epochal year in US-India relations. Only the third time that the US had rolled out, the red carpet for a state visit for an Indian leader. And, there's pomp and substance with every ceremonial visit, but there was a lot of policy and substance that came out from, the joint statement. We saw jet engines deal, the stuff in defense and technology, energy, healthcare, education. But even before the state visit, start of 2023, when the both NSAs met, Jake Sullivan and Ajit Doval, ISET coming about, and that morphed into Indasex before the state visits. Explain, you've been in government for a long time at State Department, at DOD. What sort of thinking has gone in from the US policy to give this sort of partnership on defense and critical and emerging technology with a non-traditional ally?
Yeah, thank you. And again, thanks to USISPF and ASPI for hosting this event. It's a great opportunity to talk about where things will go in this really critical partnership. Look, if you think back on technology and security, the US and India naturally have a lot of cooperation, at least a lot of common interests on security, certainly in the Indo-Pacific. And that's been true for a long time. It's something that's been recognized certainly back to when we saw this upswing in relations start in, the end of the Clinton administration, and through the next 20 odd years, you've seen a continual deepening of the defense partnership, driven by shared interests in a peaceful and stable Indo-Pacific region primarily, and sort of that being more important than differences on policy and policy implementation and, positions vis-a-vis Russia and other things like that. So you've seen that. But one of the things that has, I think, always been a little bit of a white whale for policymakers is chasing this tech cooperation, because in the private sector, US-India tech cooperation is potentially the most important tech cooperation that exists. I mean, it is, Indian Americans are leading most of the big tech companies in the United States, many of the big tech companies in the United States. A lot of the innovation comes from Indian computer scientists and engineers that do their training here. There's a lot of back and forth. Major Indian companies have major operations here. All the big American players see India as an important market and have a major presence there. And yet, when it came to the fundamentals of technology cooperation that matter from a government standpoint, so be that research and development or just cooperation in critical areas where you have major challenges like climate change or on security, it always lagged behind. And so you've seen over succeeding decades a lot of efforts to start joint technology groups, the DTTI a decade plus ago. And I think what happened now was that the political leadership in both countries basically looked around and said, we've been trying to do this tech cooperation stuff for 20 years. Maybe it just needs, some more juice and attention from the top to actually get traction. And so the decision to have the national security advisors centralize in the prime minister's office and the White House technology cooperation and launch ISET, I think is an experiment, but potentially a very successful experiment at saying like, okay, we see that, both countries have been trying to do this for a long time. Let's put political capital behind it. Let's drive both systems to overcome obstacles. And if you look at things like the GE jet engine deal, that's not a new thing. India already uses GE engines. It's been out there as an idea for a long, long time, but it's had lots of obstacles because it's technology the United States has never shared when it comes to some of the core engine technology. And even some of the less sensitive technology is not easily shared. And so it took that top level push and also a pull from the Indian side to say, we want this and are willing to commit to doing all the things we need to do to get it and integrate it, use it, protect it, and produce it, and eventually, probably sell it beyond India. So that really required the systems to get pushed past what they would normally do. And that's what I think ISET has managed to create. So I don't see that shifting. I think that attention will continue. I think the challenge will be focusing on the areas of most value and most benefit and seeing if they can deliver some real wins. The announcements have been made. None of those things have yet come to fruition, which is natural because it's not been that long. But, the devil's in the details, and it'll be, everyone's looking to see, is this really going to change everything? Or is it only going to be where the big bosses tip the scales that things get over and, you see big initiatives happening?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's fascinating, Vikram, because if I'm not mistaken, I think more countries have nuclear weapon capabilities than jet engine manufacturing capabilities. So that's kind of remarkable. I want to bring it back to Farwa. 2024 in August will mark 5 years since India and Pakistan downgraded their diplomatic relations. And if diplomatic history serves me right, it's probably the longest period, along with like 1971 to 1976, when both India and Pakistan suspended formal relations. And of course, that was at the backdrop of the 1971 war. Pakistan, of course, is obviously a country with a lot of turbulence in the politics and the economics of it in terms of IMF bailouts and what we saw last year with the political upheaval in Pakistan. Do you think relations right now, or what Michael McFaul would describe as hot peace? Cold War is a bit of a cliche term, but there's no real bonhomie, but it's going to be status quo of hot peace. Is that where you see the relations right now?
This relationship, for lack of a better word, is complicated. In 2014, there were hopes that there would be meaningful negotiations. Just taking us back to where we started with the Prime Minister Modi's first term in office, when then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif attended the inauguration ceremony, and then Prime Minister Modi's following year in 2015 visited Lahore to meet with Nawaz Sharif, which was the first of an Indian leader to Pakistan in more than a decade. But then, unfortunately, in 2016, since Uri, the relationship has been headed towards a downward spiral. And between sort of that 2016 to 2018 period, there were border skirmishes and a lot of concern around further escalation. And then when we entered 2019, of course, the Pulwama attacks unfolded, which again strained this already very tense relationship, severely impacting trade and people-to-people connectivity between these two countries. And then finally, the same year, the Indian government's decision to revoke Article 370 sort of became the final dent that has seen the diplomatic relationship downgrade ever since. But in the February 2024 election in Pakistan, when the Nawaz Sharif-led Pakistan Muslim League came to power, and there were hopes that relationship will get better. There were a lot of conversation around resuming bilateral trade, especially in the interest of, sort of Pakistan's economic crisis, which you sort of talked about in your question. But we don't foresee things to be resolved smoothly, at least in the short run, especially with China in the mix and Pakistan's ironclad relationship with China, which of course is likely going to endure, which Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is also in China to meet with President Xi Jinping just right now. So there is a lot of promise in that relationship. It's going to endure, and that could be sort of like another point, which is going to be a trigger within this India-Pakistan equation. For a long time, even though border, especially the LOC, has been peaceful since 2021, again through a ceasefire agreement, which has been held so far, there has been a war of words on international forums and such between the two countries. But I would say that this relationship has been one that has seen periods of cold pace for many years, and we may see that continue. Again, we're running through that thread of continuity. And we're likely going to see that again. Pakistan doesn't factor too much now with given India's domestic priorities and those broader foreign policy engagements on the global stage. So it's going to be likely that we'll see this continue. But for the interests of the region and generally, thinking through the South Asia spectrum, it is perhaps a good sort of change or sort of an improvement that one could see if there are broad diplomatic ties resumed, including sort of reinstating ambassador rank representatives in each other's countries, working through trade issues and building more confidence building measures. And each of these will be important steps towards a more harmonious relationship, even if they happen one at a time. But should they unfold, will they unfold, and how, that remains to be seen. And it will be an interesting space to monitor.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very opportune time to talk about India-Pakistan after the cricket match on Sunday. So maybe sport diplomacy for the win. Lisa, you spent so many years in government with the NSC, the CIA, State Department on Capitol Hill. So you've looked at the vantage point of South Asia and US-India relations and India's evolution in foreign policy from multiple angles. Right? And since 1991, since India opened up its economy, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's obviously been a shape not only in India's economy, but its foreign policy thinking. And we've seen a traditional back in the day non-alignment morph into the form of strategic autonomy. And India's foreign minister has spoken about India and multipolarity, and they want a multipolar world. Is that multipolarity the catalyst that has been seen the success of Quad and I2U2, has seen India engage more in a minilateral format and successfully so?
Well, I don't really think so, and I'll explain why. I think that India's concept of multipolarity is rooted in its idea of India, having a strategic autonomy and wanting to increase its influence on the global stage. And I think India, has traditionally assessed that it is not well served by either a unipolar or a bipolar world. But I think that approach to multipolarity misunderstands the current realities of the world we're living in. And that's because Russia and China are enhancing their partnership. We can look at the February 2022, famous No Limits Partnership statement meeting that was held between President Xi and President Putin, which really spelled out very clearly where they wanted to take the world and how they are trying to undermine U.S. global influence and the rules-based order from which India also benefits. So I think multipolarity to Russia and China means Russia and China shaping or bending the world more to their own interests and, strengthening authoritarian ideology across the globe, which is certainly not in India's interest. So I think there is a big difference between how India conceives multipolarity and, what we are seeing, what multipolarity means to other countries. And, we may have not wanted to see the rise of these informal blocks of power, but that's frankly what's happening. And we've been hearing more about even Russia-China cooperation with North Korea, with Iran. My boss, Richard Fontaine, recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs talking about the axis of upheaval. Some people call it the arc of authoritarians. So we really are seeing, kind of these informal or loose blocks that are coming up. And so for the U.S., the rise of the minilateral, or this idea of fostering these multiple groupings of countries that have overlapping interests, the like-minded countries that have the same interest in seeing peace and stability, in seeing the protection of sovereignty and independence of nations. That is how the U.S. is conceiving it. And I think it's working quite well. Frankly, we've already talked about the Quad. I said a few words about the Squad. You also have the U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral. You had a historic summit between these three countries at Camp David last August. You had a historic first ever summit between U.S., Japan, and Philippines. So you've got all these different groupings of countries, but all with the same vision, all driving towards, maintaining a free and open order, and, pushing against, frankly, what Russia and China are trying to do. So I think, India is very much a part of that, informal networked relationships. But still, I think, there are parts of the Indian establishment that have this vision of multipolarity where, there are, 5 or 6 poles of power that each have, equal weight. I just don't think that's realistic. I don't think that's the way our world is headed.
I mean, if I can, Akshobh, just to
Please
jump in on that. I think Lisa's exactly right. It's a different view. India views a world of sort of more benign multipolarity, right? Where you can work together in different groupings and coalitions to mutual benefit. And, it sort of all works out for the best. And I think the minilaterals that India is participating in, it approaches from that lens. It's the path to cooperation outside of getting locked into, one side or another. And I think, like a lot of other countries, the legacy of the Cold War is different for the United States and Russia than it is for everybody else. Everybody else was sort of pushed into one or another camp and is trying to avoid that kind of, decision being forced on them, whether it's Southeast Asia worrying about having to choose between the U.S. and China, or anybody else basically post-colonial states, the global South, don't want to have to choose. And a lot of it comes from there. So India is approaching these minilaterals as a way to make sure it's a part of protecting an order that's favorable to Indian interests, which is similar to the order that is favorable to U.S. interests. It wants to do that without losing freedom of action in other areas to maintain a cooperative relationship with Russia, with Iran. Quite frankly, it would be interesting to see how India would approach China, were China to decide to, take a chill pill and, maybe go back to the table and relax on the line of actual control and, not be such an aggressive neighbor vis-a-vis India. I think India would be interested in that case potentially in trying to get back to something more normal. Now, that ship may have sailed because China has pushed so hard for so long. And I think Chinese aggression is probably counterproductive for their own interests at this point. But, India's trying to have the best of multiple worlds in a multipolar era that they think is coming, irrespective of what anybody wants, actually. They just think it's sort of the nature of the international system that's ahead of us in the 21st century. That does mean there will be points of tension and between India and its other partners. But I think India has shown itself very adept at navigating those sorts of differences, and not just vis-a-vis the United States, but the United States, Europe, its partners in other parts of Asia, in Africa, and of course, most notably with Russia.
Yeah, I know, and thank you, and Vikram and Lisa, you touched on Russia and China, and Vikram, this question to you, someone who's got that portfolio on his plate and a very heavy plate is NSA Jake Sullivan. I think third time's a charm in terms of a visit to India. I think that was evinced from the call, President Biden's call to Prime Minister Modi, congratulating him on a third term as well. I think the previous two visits were impending, got cancelled. One, of course, for the ISET dialogues. If I could ask you this, one is, since we touched on ISET before, how do you see ISET cooperation further elevating? And since NSA Sullivan had to cancel his visits because of the situation in the Middle East, one of the other things that came out of the G20, the hallmark, was the IMEC, the India, Middle East, European Economic Corridor. With all the crisis that's going on in that part of the world, do you see the IMEC stalling or delayed progress?
Wow, yeah. So that gets us into another arena of mini-lateral cooperation, IMEC and I2U2, which was Israel, UAE, India, and the United States. I guess there's a difference between what is happening now and what is clearly still wanted by all of those parties that are involved. I think IMEC and I2U2 have broad and enthusiastic support from all the countries that touch them. This is the idea of getting an economic corridor going, has a lot of interest from Egypt to Saudi to other Gulf partners and to European partners that would be on the far end of that. And it's a priority in India. I2U2 is similar. All the parties want to make something happen there. And just as Jake Sullivan's trip was derailed by, Iran, the last one, by Iran launching attacks against Israel directly for the first time in history, missiles flying over the region and into Israel. These forums are being temporarily sort of impeded by the crisis in the Middle East. What is interesting to me is how that has not shaken the underlying interest of all the parties in getting things back on track. So I think there's a lot of pent up focus, a desire and focus, and a willingness to make investments and a willingness to make deals. You see right now the U.S. trying very hard to give the Saudis a security deal that might encourage them to keep going down the path they were on before October 7th and the Hamas atrocities against Israel and the ensuing war, and to move towards normalization. I think all of that is still ultimately in the interests of all the major players in the region, and they're going to try to figure out how to get there. But this war is undoubtedly, more than a small. This is not just a small stone in the shoe. This has the potential for derailing some of that cooperation, depending on how things go in the next year.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that's definitely something to wait and watch for, to see what IMEC happens and what I2U2, because it's a bit nebulous around what's up with I2U2. Farwa, speaking of nebulous, there's this thing about SARC and what really is the future for SARC, because we live in a world right now where data crosses borders faster than people and planes. And while, of course, SARC will never be an EU, that's not just a pipe dream, that's just not feasible, just given the history of the region and the hostilities that may have existed. But can SARC afford to not be connected and be the least economically integrated bloc, especially at a time of increasing data trade and connectivity?
Akshobh, it is rather unfortunate that a vibrant and growing and dynamic region such as South Asia remains to be the least integrated in the world. SARC, particularly, which just mentioned, has not held an annual summit since 2014 and pretty much has been stagnant since 2016. And much has to do with, of course, the India-Pakistan dynamic playing out within the region and within the organization. Numerous agreements have been signed and institutional mechanisms that have been established under SARC. They have not been adequately implemented as well. So, it has been faced with multitude of challenges. Even though there has been a positive outcome, which is often shared, which is the South Asian Free Trade Agreement or SAFTA. But even with that, the inter-regional trade, talking about connectivity and the importance of it growing, the trade just still stands at about 5%, which is extremely low. Another big challenge within just this whole SARC framework is that there is no conflict resolution arrangement built into the framework, which means that whenever there is a bilateral or a trilateral issue, it unfortunately cannot be worked through this platform. It halts progress rather. So the organization and the way SARC's looked at, the approach to it, it needs heavy recalibration. To make SARC functioning and more effective, it just not only needs reforms, that's 100% true, it needs institutional reforms, but also there has to be a real incentive for political will to be mobilized towards a more collective regional approach. There is hope that remains that it will be able to revive, but it needs some sort of like a common challenge that brings these countries together. And we have this, with the day and age that we live in, climate change perhaps is one of the biggest challenges that is being faced by the region. So it could very well be the catalyst to bring SARC back to life. Unfortunately, the pandemic couldn't really do that. There were hopes tied to it, but that didn't really work out as well as it was aspired to. And there's so many alternative blocks now. We talked about BIMSTEC earlier, that has all of these countries sharing more cordial relationships than the SARC countries. And BIMSTEC, of course, has this edge because it serves as a bridge between South Asia and Southeast Asia. There's, of course, the BBIN as well. India has, in the past years, resorted to more bilateral engagement in the region than going through these regional platforms, or working through the BIMSTEC or the BBIN through more of that Indian Ocean lens or the Bay of Bengal lens. So much will be needed to reinvigorate SARC and bring it back to favor. And the responsibility will lie with each of these member countries to really step up their game and really call for that collective approach to the whole institution, organization, and just the feeling of SARC. Perhaps India, being that regional heavyweight, could take the lead in some of it, but really it has to be a holistic and a collective effort.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen politics in the past derail progress, and Lisa, when we speak about the elephant in the room, it's always a dragon, the China factor, clearly, and a lot of your work is centered on Indo-Pacific South Asia policy as well. And we didn't get to a full-fledged Quad summit last year. President Biden, of course, had to be pulled away with domestic commitments. And there's a concern right now this year also with the US also in elections. This is the year the world votes. Do you see, some of those formalities of foreign policy of the Quad summit and the 2+2 perhaps getting a little delayed? Furthermore, we know the Quad is far from an Asian NATO. A lot of work has been done on vaccine diplomacy, clean energy, technology, education, and so on. But there's still a securitization, and we've seen joint military drills now becoming a key framework of the Quad. And given the notion of a free and Indo-Pacific being so sacrosanct, the Quad, how much of the securitization is now the central element of the Quad?
Well, look, I don't think the Quad is ever going to be a explicit military grouping. India has been very clear on its desire to not see the Quad move in that direction. And, like you said, there have been naval drills, there have been exercises. The Malabar exercise does include the U.S., India, Japan, and more recently Australia, but it is not classified as a Quad activity, even though it involves the Quad countries. So, a minor but important distinction. And, frankly, the ASEAN nations, the Southeast Asian nations, would not accept a sort of militarized Quad. And, that would defeat the whole purpose. If Quad is not sort of accepted in the region, it defeats the entire purpose of the Quad, which is trying to shape the future direction of the region. And of course, when the Quad has received the most support from the Southeast Asian nations is when it has delivered public goods to the region, vaccines, infrastructure, even maritime domain awareness capabilities, things that the Southeast Asian nations can really see a benefit from. But all of that said, some of the recent Chinese activity, particularly in the South China Sea against the Philippines, preventing the Philippines from being able to resupply Second Thomas Shoal, this is increasingly calling for a unified position from the Quad and stronger statements condemning such Chinese aggression. And it's calling for sort of support for the Philippines so that it's clear that the Quad is backing the Philippines. So, I think we need to see more of that strong unified position from the Quad, and maybe even some activities there where they're supporting the Philippines. I don't know what that is, economic assistance or disaster relief assistance. You have the Luzon corridor, which was announced during the U.S.-Japan-Philippines summit, but very important for connectivity and building up digital infrastructure. So there are ways that the Quad could show its support to the Philippines without it being military support. But India is also developing a stronger defense relationship with the Philippines, a bilateral relationship. It's, exporting the BrahMos missile to the Philippines. So India does not shy away from that defense and security support on a bilateral basis. But I think, we're not going to see India support any Quad, explicit military defense cooperation or support for any one country. Even though I think there is a need to see stronger statements on Chinese aggression. And that will sort of be a test, I think, for India. Will it agree to those stronger statements? Will it agree to showing Quad unity when it comes to addressing Chinese aggression in the South China Sea?
Yeah, and before I go to Vikram, just a reminder as we get to the business end of the webinar, please send any questions in if you have it. Use the Q&A chat box below, and if your question is addressed to a particular panelist, please mention the name, and I'll try my best to get to them. Vikram, since I asked Lisa about the Quad, and you touched a little about I2U2, it's sort of loosely spoken about as the West Asia Quad. There's no similar Indo-Pacific to speak of, but there is the similarity of precluding a Beijing hegemony in West Asia, given China and Iran have a strategic partnership as well. And you also mentioned IMEC. Will the IMEC now kind of supersede I2U2, bring it in? And if I2U2 is not a West Asia Quad, how is it different?
Well, I think what's similar about the Quad and the West Asia Quad is that they're focused on constructive economic and other areas of cooperation. So if you look at what I2U2 has announced, it's not a ton of things, but it's been in food security, it's been in clean energy areas like that. And we're, IMEC feels more like like an alternative to sort of BRI, China style, major connectivity infrastructure investments that have a coordinated, in the Chinese case, sort of China setting out what it's willing to do and getting partners to take their assistance, their loans, their construction workers to build these things. And it feels like the IMEC is more designed to sort of offer alternatives to that in a more collaborative way rather than the sort of Chinese method. But I think like the Quad, I2U2 is just it's not about security. And one of the things that I think China has had the jump on for a lot of these countries is that China's been the one out there handing out more large scale assistance or loans, often very risky loans that create a lot of some of this debt trap diplomacy and stuff like that. But it's been hard for the United States and Europe to sort of compete with that in the affirmative. So a lot of times when you're traveling in the region, people say, well, we look to you for security, but we're looking to China for for money and investment and new railways and new ports and things like that. And you see a concerted effort through the Quad and I2U2 to generate alternatives to that kind of Chinese development diplomacy and the influence that China is trying to get through that, and to provide other avenues of partnership across the region. And I do think I think it's almost like the Quad gets securitized by the commentariat, by those of us on the outside. People insist on calling it the Quad Security Dialogue, which it never was. It started as a humanitarian response to the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. India revived it more, after Galwan, partly because of security concerns vis-a-vis China, but also seeing it as a way to compete with China in this economic diplomacy, in these economic arenas in the region, and to gain influence that way. So I think it is more focused on affirmative cooperation, and will stay that way, even if it has some security elements.
Yeah, I think the central element of IMEC to compete with the BRI is the transparency factor, as you rightly said, avoiding debt trap diplomacy. Farwa, apart from South Asia, a lot of your work is also climate, water, energy, environment. It was not too long ago when we remember President Clinton saying the most dangerous place on earth was, the LOC between India and Pakistan, given both had gone nuclear then. And when we talk about threats to South Asia, there's always the nuclear threat that keeps coming up. But a common threat is climate, and all of South Asia faces that. Climate's a very pernicious threat. We've seen how climate's gotten codified in a lot of foreign policy discourse as well. We've seen US and India coalesce a lot on climate vis-a-vis the Quad and I2U2, and even with IMEC as well, and the Strategic Clean Energy Partnership. So perhaps if you could paint a picture of how you see US-India climate cooperation going forward, and what can South Asia do to come together? Because nuclear puts countries apart, but climate can bring countries together. As Vikram also touched on, the Quad had its origins in climate, given the tsunami of 2004 that ravaged parts of Sri Lanka and southern India and other parts as well. So how can climate bring these countries together and perhaps give SAARC momentum?
Yeah, sure. So to a lot of what Lisa and Vikram both said in terms of the overall state of the relationship between US and India, and I'm trying to answer the first part of your question, which is focused on how US and India could coalesce further. We do expect continuity here as well. The US-India Energy Partnership, or their work on climate, to remain on track and to even grow. As you pointed out, the imperative to combat climate change and foster sustainable development has thrust climate and energy issues to the forefront of the US-India bilateral relationship in many ways. This area, along with, when you talk about Quad and all of these other multilaterals where US and India have come together, climate change, energy cooperation also brings a convergence of interests and the potential to leverage the complementarity in expertise and resources between the two countries. We look forward very quickly. There are good examples and models and frameworks that could be built upon in this relationship. And further, like the US-India Partnership to Advance Clean Energy, or PACE, or the US-India Climate and Clean Energy Agenda 2030 Partnership. Especially now with this ambition, the net zero ambition that India has and is working through it, the US can potentially assist India by facilitating access to funds for India's ambitious goals and working towards an equitable national energy transition plan, one that also considers the socioeconomic impact of the larger coal phase out for this 1.4 billion population country. Maybe there's also a way for this energy partnership to expand and have a larger sort of regional lens to it and regional benefits as well. Now, coming to South Asia, of course, there's no denying that climate vulnerability is one of the most imperative, one of the most critical risks that is faced by the region, whether we're talking about the heat waves or the air pollution, or we're talking about floods, droughts, and water. All of these have been wreaking havoc in the region. And like SAARC, we talked about, there has been little sort of collaboration when it comes to this, but there needs to be more. There definitely has to be a lot more that needs to be done in terms of regional cooperation, especially on climate change. There has to be a lot more integration because climate change is an important transboundary, transnational issue. And it deserves the same level of policy attention as some of the other hard security things that we've talked about, and we continue to talk about in the region by way of like tractor diplomacy or back-channel diplomacy. I think climate change also deserves that. Effective climate diplomacy and water diplomacy can very well be the key to sort of easing out some of the regional level tensions and ensuring a continued dialogue, or providing a platform by way of which not only these regional stakeholders can come together, but also international partners can come together. And the best way to do it is to make sure that from within the region, you're not only just engaging with the governments, but you're also bringing the CSOs, you're also bringing in the private sector, you're also bringing in the academia and the scientists, so that you have a more of a holistic way of sort of decision making or policy making that is for the benefit and for the sustainability of the resources for the region. Because there's a lot of it tied to politicization and securitization of things, water security or water scarcity in the region is a massive transboundary issue. A lot of countries that are sharing these major rivers, they don't have a formal water sharing agreement, and these major rivers traverse disputed borders. And India and China being one of the most important examples, the Brahmaputra, but also India and Pakistan, where thankfully through the Indus Waters Treaty, we have a good example of an agreement that has stood the test of wars and is still intact. That's another conversation that it might need a 2.0 version of it. But the region can definitely benefit from better cooperation on all of these challenges, and water particularly, data sharing, river basin-wide coordination. All of this is essential to ensuring not only just that you're protecting the lives and livelihoods of the regional population, but also it's very important to keep an eye out on it and have an ongoing dialogue to make sure that there's no further securitization or politicization of shared resources.
I know we're almost at time, but I want one final question for Lisa and then one question for Vikram, since we started late. Lisa, in some ways, I think Alyssa Ayers in a book writes, India, our time has come. It's very redolent to what we're seeing in India's foreign policy, India's projection on the world stage. And we saw it last year in G20, just following the state visit, where India tried to bat for the global south, try to be peacemaker between Russia and the West. I know it's hard being soothsayer, but given all your years in government and seeing the evolution of Indian foreign policy, where do you see Indian foreign policy headed? I know there's continuity, but if you could look at a 5-10 year mark, where do you see that for New Delhi?
Well, I think India's strongest foreign policy asset really is its soft power. And I think India played to that soft power during its leadership of the G20 with its digital infrastructure initiative. And I think the countries of the global south appreciate India's way of doing things, its focus on things like development and economics. And so I think that moving forward, I hope India continues to use that very vital asset, which could even, help the United States if the U.S. and India can partner together in some of these initiatives, particularly in Southeast Asia. I think India has entree into these countries that the U.S. just does not have because of history and the perceptions of how the U.S. Is doing things. So, that is truly an asset that India, should capitalize on as it moves forward. You mentioned Russia. Look, I think India has played a helpful role on Russia in some ways. For instance, in the fall of 2022, when Russia was, tossing around the idea of using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, doing that nuclear saber rattling, I think India did play a helpful role in kind of, signaling Russia that in no way, shape, or form would this be acceptable. And, China did the same thing, frankly. So, that was helpful. I don't think India would take the risk of trying to mediate between the U.S. and Russia, or trying to, mediate a solution to Ukraine. I think that's way too risky for India because it depends on its relationships with both the U.S. and Russia, and trying to bring, the two sides together, which are so far apart right now, I don't think India is going to be willing to take that risk. I think it realizes it has limits to the influence it can bring to bear on Russia, frankly. So in that case, I think, India will, continue to build up the U.S. relationship. It's not going to turn its back on Russia, but I think it will also, when push comes to shove, it could play a helpful role in terms of trying to, moderate some of Russia's behavior. And, we saw that on the nuclear issue. We could see that with regard to other issues. But mediation, no, I don't think they'll go as far as trying to mediate between the U.S. and Russia.
Thank you, Lisa and Vikram, to bring us home and bring us to the close of the webinar. Since Lisa set it up so nicely with Russia, it's been 2 years since the war in Ukraine, and initially looked like a delicate dance in India's foreign policy, this legacy P5 partner they've had in the erstwhile Soviet Union, the military relationship, or today's modern day India's energy relationship with Russia, but a very strong strategic partnership with the United States. And we saw a lot of the commentary get it wrong initially, and perhaps still does. What should the West understand better on how India sees the world and India's own place in the world, just so people try and understand India's foreign policy vis-a-vis the situation?
Well, I mean, I think Western leaders have shown themselves to be very well versed in understanding India and very pragmatic in their approach overall. I mean, obviously, the West would love India to be fully on, fully on their team, whether it's at the UN or in the court of public opinion or behind the scenes. But they also recognize that India faces certain realities, whether that's all its legacy strategic military systems being of Russian origin, or simply the fact that it needs a lot of what you get in the world from Russia and, frankly, Ukraine, whether, fuel, fertilizer, all these areas. And, bottom line is India, this war is terrible for India. And I'm sure India privately expresses pretty substantial displeasure with Russia for taking the world down this path. It is not helpful to India in any way. India was doing much better when it had, students in Russia and Ukraine, and was sourcing things from Russia and Ukraine, and those were both valuable partnerships. And you've seen India be careful to keep relations and communications open with both, not just with Russia, but also with Ukraine, and to provide some humanitarian assistance and others. So I think in the official circles, there's been a fair amount of understanding. Even the attempt, you can debate how successful it has or hasn't been, to keep Russian oil flowing, but with a price cap in their service of not having a massive spike in global energy prices. India's role in that is, of course, as a buyer of that capped Russian oil. And again, you can argue about how that's working or not working, but guess who does who's off taking a lot of that oil once it's no longer Russian because it's gone to India and been processed into other petroleum products? That's the United States and Europe, right? So these things are never really black and white. And I think India is basically telling the West, the world's not black and white. We can be a partner in navigating the not black and white world, which means some things are good and some things are complicated, but we can really do it. I think where India sees its biggest value add is what Lisa was saying: soft power, economic power, the fact that it's a very trusted partner in a lot of places where European or Western powers might be less trusted. You could see more of, I really like seeing the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, DFC, partnering with in Sri Lanka to build the Colombo port with an Indian giant conglomerate. Adani is building that port, and then financing is coming from the U.S. You could see that with Japan, with European partners, in more cases with the United States, where Indian industry is getting in the game. India has so much to do at home that its industry tends to be very domestic focused. It's not been subsidized like Chinese industry to go out and build stuff, whether it's economically viable or not. But this combination of financing from wealthy nations and partnering with their industry and Indian industry in third countries, that could be very compelling, and that could bring really meaningful options and opportunities to a lot of the developing world, with India being a big part of those processes, with transparency, with good environmental and labor standards and things like that coming along with the package. So I see a lot of potential for India partnering with the United States and its allies and partners in helping bring development to lots of the rest of the world in the coming decades.
I think that's a good note, allies and partners. And you're at USISPF. Thank ASPI and Farwa for partnering with us on this. Lisa and Vikram, thank you so much for your time. And for both of you, who've served a lot of years in government. You've been architects of the US-India relationship and getting it to where it is. So thank you both so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us on this webinar. And apologies again for the delay, but I think we got our 1 hour's worth of riveting analysis. So Farwa, Vikram, Lisa, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.